cloud. Okay, I think we are just about set here then. I guess we can get this kicked off then. Or is there, Sarah, anything else that we're waiting for on your end, you think?
No, I just might want to give people 1 or 2 more minutes if you want to, I was gonna swear, talk to people for a
Yeah,
minute.
so sounds good. I guess maybe, and I'll probably end up repeating something to this effect, but this is the very first time we've done anything like this, and we decided to keep it ultra lightweight for this purpose. So really just a basic Zoom call, and Sarah and Daniela, our co-hosts, will be manning the spotlight stuff to make sure we have kind of something of a stage. But otherwise, it's very simple and lightweight there. Um, well, cool. I really appreciate everyone being here for Scarf's first ever event. Um, Everything that we are doing here today, I think, the very cutting edge of this discipline of usage analytics in open source and really the professionalization of open source broadly. And so it's really exciting that we've gone from, 5 years ago when we were getting all this stuff started. Most of the people that we would talk to would tell us something to the effect of, what you are trying to do with Scarf will never work. The open source community will always feel the way it feels now, which is that analytics are basically just a hard no, it will never happen, and just leave it there. And fast forward 5 years, Scarf has been able to partner with some of the biggest open source foundations, kind of find the right way to do open source analytics. And overall, I think, spawn a real movement in the open source world, which all of you are a very integral part of. And so I just want to thank you all for being here. For those that are watching after the fact, thank you for tuning in. And today, yeah, we have a lot to talk about from just where we are in this ecosystem and discipline of usage analytics in the open source world. We're going to talk about some success stories with that so far and learn a little bit about how folks in the Scarf community are leveraging Scarf today, how that's been going for them, what they're working on, that kind of thing. We will then have some time to talk about some product updates from Scarf and kind of the latest of what we've been rolling out and what our roadmap will consist of going forward. We have time for some Q&A from anyone else in the community that wants to, whether it's asking questions, clarifying on our roadmap, anything like that. And then we will have kind of a bonus section of the event where I'm going to talk to Matt Trifiro, who's here as well, just a little bit more about kind of the background and history that led us to where we are today. Yeah, and so I think other things to call out here. So this is if apologies if you already heard me go through this, but yeah, this is the first time we've done something like this, and any feedback on how we can make these kinds of events better, going forward, will be very appreciated. We will have time for Q&A, so I would say during the presentations, maybe hold questions until the end, but otherwise, we definitely want this to be as interactive as we can. And this is, not a huge group, so we can definitely try to make it pretty conversational and more intimate in that way. I'm trying to think. And then what else any other kind of logistics and administration stuff? I mean, I think it's also, helpful to maybe set the stage here a little bit, talking about just where Scarf is right now as a company, which I think, tracks really, really closely to how this discipline is being accepted in the open source community. We went from, when we got started, when Scarf really got going, we were talking about maybe tracking somewhere on the order of like 100,000 open source downloads a week. And that's where Scarf first raised its first round of financing. That's where it became clear that there was kind of something to this idea has legs, that this is something that is needed in the open source world. Last quarter, Scarf did 500 million events on our infrastructure. And that was and that comprised of, I think it was about 15 million unique sources of traffic that were being tracked in that data. 95% of the Fortune 500 comprised of that traffic as well. And so what we can glean from that is that A, um, open source is being very, very heavily adopted, is in use everywhere. The biggest companies all over the world, this stuff is mission critical to a lot of businesses. And those of you here who are working on your own open source companies, are right in the heart of, why that is so exciting. And, our mission here at Scarf is to see more of that, to help, foster more open source in the world, have more sustainable open source, and just to see that be the default approach to building software companies. And I think, we'll hear from, when we hear from Max and Evan shortly about, companies like Preset, that, these are the kinds of businesses that could just as easily not be open source. And we very much want to see more of that over time. And so, I commend all of you who, are here working on various open source businesses. We wish you nothing but success, and we want to do everything we can to help facilitate that. Yeah, and so let me think if there's much else here. Yeah, I think the folks that we have here today so far, and just from folks that registered, we have a cohort of just our own team here at Scarf, but also folks, whether it's startups, much bigger companies, more indie open source maintainers, and kind of all over the map there. Obviously, I think there's definitely a commercial skew to the kinds of things that we do. But this is really a pretty, broadly applicable practice that we want the broader open source community to adopt and become, more, just more effective at whatever it is that we're trying to do. And so, in general, I think my ask to everyone here, I think, is that we really want to hear from all of you. I think we really want to cultivate more community between all of us, open source, commercial open source practitioners. I think it's still overall a pretty small group and community, all things considered. But all the people here are really at the cutting edge of a lot of different software ecosystems throughout, different industries, different verticals, different backgrounds. It's a very intellectually diverse crew in that way. And I'm really looking forward to, hearing more from all of you, learning from how all of you are putting this kind of stuff into practice. And overall, we can all kind of lift each other's businesses up in that way. So again, thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to start to dig into this stuff. And so with that, I can introduce our first speakers. So yeah, so we have Max and Evan from Preset, which is a company that commercializes Apache Superset, which is a very really established Apache Software Foundation project. And I think many of you may relate to that aspect of what they'll have to say when it comes to working within the confines of a foundation. Max, also the original author of Apache Airflow, and so a very, very prolific open source work. And I think everyone here will get a lot out of their experience. And so maybe I'll leave it there, hand it over to Max and Evan, and if you want to add anything more to your backgrounds that I missed, feel free to add.
Yeah, I'll say a few things to get started. First thing is I try to extend my weekend until today, and I just got out of an RV, a long trip. So I was on the road this morning in the wine country, and now I'm back close to home, but not quite there. So it's been a hectic morning. Evan prepared a bunch of slides for us that I'm very familiar with, going to recycle a bunch of slides. So we have a lot to say about commercial open source, about product analytics, open source analytics. So there's a lot to say here. We can do a quick intro, but I think the intro is already done on my side. So huge open source practitioner advocate. That all started for me when I joined Airbnb in 2014, where I joined with the ambition and based on the premise that I would work on open source there. So I wanted to recreate some of the internal tooling that existed at Facebook, where I was coming from at the time. So Meta was a bit ahead in terms of like big data, There were some really interesting projects internally there, some open source, some not open source, and opportunities to take some of these really great ideas and bring, I was going to say, like, bring things like Airflow and Superset to market, but not to market, to the open source community. So it's trying to find a project community fit, and got lucky to get a lot of traction when I started working on that. And ultimately, I went on to start a company. So there was a time where I believe, based on the success of companies like Confluent and Databricks, the venture capitalists started to look at open source projects that are successful out there, and start thinking about, like, can we fund some companies in the space? And I think around that time, right around like 2018, 19, 2020, there's like definitely a wave of investment coming from the VCs looking to fund open source creators, really, or open source, practitioners and projects. So that's a bit of my story. There'll be a lot more to say, but that's my not so quick intro.
And I just came along for the ride with Max is the short version of it. Really, I've been using open source forever, but I've only been contributing to open source by way of Superset for the past 5.5 years, something like that. And it's been a heck of a ride. So maybe we'll tell you a little bit of the story about what we've built with, well, starting with Superset itself. We'll show you a little preview of what the product is, and then get into our scarf story some more. We already covered the intros. If you ever want to reach us, there's our, contact info. Feel free to reach out. But Max, you're probably most versed to talk to these slides if you want to give the overview of where the project came from and what it's all about.
Totally. So essentially, Apache Superset is simply open source BI in many ways. And something that's interesting about that is that we are very much in product analytics and try to understand how people engage with our products, and how our product interactions grow, this sort of things, but really focused on usually company data, whatever it might be. So a lot of our customers are using Apache Superset to do product analytics, but really all sorts, or any kind of analytics. There's an interesting parallel with Scarf there too, because we use Scarf to do open source analytics of a BI tool, which is kind of interesting. So it gets a bit meta here. Why open source BI? And what are some of the reasons why you would use Apache Superset? So if you don't want vendor lock-in, you want more flexibility around how you run things on our side. So deploy where you want. That would mean like potentially on-prem or within your infrastructure. Do all sorts of customization and the ability to contribute or be part of something bigger. But yeah, I wrote an article a while back. I think that's called Future BI is Open Source. So you can read about more about like why open source is taking over the world, especially in the domain that we're in. We're super well connected with every pretty much database out there in the world that speaks SQL. So this is the subset of this, and it's Apache Superset itself is used absolutely everywhere. It used to be hard to estimate exactly how many companies might be using Apache Superset. Now we have more visibility into that. We'll talk about it in a moment. We have an Advanced SQL IDE as part of the product. Superset is very much a call it data exploration, visualization, dashboarding application, but we also have this SQL IDE as part of the product. So this is our drag and drop explorer. So here you have a Tableau-like interface or traditional BI type of interface where you can latch onto a data set. In this case, it looks like a vehicle sales data set, and drag and drop things, all sorts of visualizations, visualization plugins too. So if you're not satisfied with the probably 50 plus visualizations we have, you can create your own as well. And this is the dashboarding part. So your normal interactive dashboard with little filters on the left here on top, and cross filtering, and these nice interactive dashboards that have come to be in part of everyone's daily work pretty much nowadays. So build dashboards, share that in minutes. It's all open source. So yeah, let's talk about Preset a little bit. So Preset is the commercial entity. So we offer Apache Superset as a hosted service. Interestingly, the letters of Preset are a subset of the letter of Superset. It's a little bit of a geeky play on anagrams or subset letters here, set theory and stuff like that. We run the best, like simple, reliable, performant Superset at scale is essentially what we do. So the value that we add on top of Superset, so there is the managed service, enterprise reliability, scalable, enterprise grade, lower total cost of ownership. So we're better than anyone else at running our software because we contribute heavily to it. So we're able to run the software in a better quality, a better way, and a cheaper way than other people could do it. And that allows us to pass down some of these savings to the customers. And then we have all sorts of bells and whistle too. So I won't get too much into the pitch of like why Preset over Superset, but essentially it is like the most reliable, leading edge, most stable, but also cutting edge version of Superset with all sorts of add-ons and bells and whistles on top. Did you want to take it from here, Evan?
Yeah, you did well for having not seen those slides before. Nice job. So then, going into our use case for Scarf, there's a lot of things that as a community we wanted to get a handle on. Support being a key one. We never really had the insight before of what versions people are using or installing, or what the general growth of the product is, how many people out there in the wild are using it, and is it going up or down, all that stuff. And then of course engagement, which is where the company list that Scarf provides really comes in for us as a community. So we can kind of reach out to those people, whether it's in the case of Preset, maybe for marketing. We could talk about that a little bit, but usually it's more that we want to bring organizations closer to the project and help us evangelize it or contribute to it and all sorts of things like that. So the process of adding Scarf to Superset has been an interesting ride. And thankfully the Scarf team was there to help us through the first several steps of this. A lot of it had to do with the Apache Software Foundation itself. And for those who are not familiar with it, Apache is a software foundation that actually effectively owns Superset. They own the trademarks. They're the ones that are in control of the repo. And they're in control of all the governance of that software and how we run the project. So there's a lot of interesting protocols and red tape and things that we've learned about along the way. And one of their key things that they're concerned with a lot is privacy. So when something like telemetry and these kind of metrics come up, eyebrows are raised. And thankfully, Scarf had already done a lot of the pre-work here by getting a DPA in place with the Apache Software Foundation, which made our jobs a heck of a lot easier. Data processing agreement for those who are not familiar, so that we can safely capture IPs with permission.
I'll say a thing or two here
Sure.
about the Apache Software Foundation too. But I think in many ways they're the governing entity, and they make sure that everyone is behaving well around open source. And with commercial interests, at times you could have incentives in the wrong place. And they are extremely cautious of like setting up a governance model that prevents commercial entities from taking over the project or from running some sort of anything else that is not a meritocracy. So we have a pure, true meritocracy, and it keeps everyone honest and well behaved. Sometimes at the cost of like some sort of oversight and friction, but it's all for the greater good. One thing I wanted to say too is just like being in open source for a long time before using Scarf, there's always this tip of the iceberg thing, and then you can kind of see a little bit what's under the water, but you mostly see what's on top of the water, and you kind of guess what's under, and you're like, oh, is it 10% or 20% that's above the surface? So it's really, really hard to tell how well you're doing outside of just pure, simple downloads and anecdotal things, the glimpses of things you catch or you hear at a conference that this company is using your product, but you really don't see much of what's under the surface with just like normal open source lack of analytics.
Right. And so to get something like Scarf implemented, to find out some of that stuff that's under the surface, we have to go through the consensus building process. And we don't need to go in depth, but if there's anybody that's watching this or visiting from an Apache project that wants to implement Scarf, we'd be happy to talk to you and tell you all about how we did it, where we did what we call a SIP, a superset improvement proposal, to get people to vote on adding the telemetry pixel into the product. That's key. Everybody has to be on board with it. And then some other consensus around getting other pixels in places in the NPM Scarf.js package, things like that. And we started spreading these pixels all over the place once we got the okay from the community. So we've got them in the product itself. That was probably the biggest achievement. But we also have them in documentation all over on our repo, on our wiki, all sorts of things. In the product itself, we just have a handy dandy little React component here. And we made it so that by providing an environment variable, when you're starting up the product, if you say Scarf Analytics equals false, then it turns off the NPM stats, it turns off the pixel, and you can just basically opt out of everything. So that made people pretty cozy with it.
We went opt-in, we went opt-out by default too. So we wanted for analytics to be on by default and for to provide the ability for people to turn it off. But I think if you do the other way around, it might seem more ethical in some ways, but then you don't really get to take a real peek of what's under the iceberg. So you're just dealing with different shape of or physics around the iceberg itself if you go that route. So I'm really glad we went that way. I would definitely recommend for people to have opt out as the default when implementing something like Scarf.
Yeah, and we had to make everybody cozy with that. So to do that, as I'm illustrating here, there's documentation all over the place. We were shouting it from the mountaintops that we were doing this, and here's how you use it. Here's the value. Here's how safe it is. All that good stuff. So what we've learned are a number of things, and we share these every month in our Superset town halls. So that's been a huge value for the community. One of the main things is adoption of versions of the software. So this is gathered by the in-product pixel, and we can see stuff here that 4.0 is our newest major release, and we're seeing that adopted pretty well. But we also see that 3.1.0, the last major, is still widely in use. So ideally, we want to get people to adopt the new major version, but we're also seeing in some cases that the patch versions are not being updated, which means people might be having security problems, or who knows. But this really gives us insight to go after people upgrading, and also figure out if there is a security issue, God forbid, then we know how many versions back we have to patch. So things like knowing the security fallout of something and also knowing the adoption of our latest releases is just huge for us. Again, this is the same kind of thing, and actually what you see in downloads and what you see in the pixel usage doesn't always line up, which is something interesting. We found out that even though we're seeing more downloads of 4.0.1 by a mile, we're seeing a lot more usage of 4.0.0. So if you kind of have to look at both stats and surmise the reason as you will, but they're both equally important. And then, of course, general community growth is something we always want to keep an eye on. So just looking at downloads over time and seeing that number slowly tick up is just kind of a universal KPI everybody wants. And then similarly, we can use the pixel to just infer overall usage, because it grabs every page view from the app by URL, and we see this spike. So we're just looking at very recent data here. I don't know why things were really used over this brief period here, but somebody went crazy. If anybody has theories, I'm open, but it's certainly interesting to see. And of course, in terms of troubleshooting bugs and things like that, we're really easily able to narrow it down by platform and browser and things like that, which is super helpful. And last but not least, this is probably the big hit of Scarf, is figuring out who actually is using this thing. And from where we sit as a commercial open source company, that can be a little sensitive. Working with the Apache Software Foundation, they want to remain vendor neutral, so we can't just go spamming everybody or anything like that. But it is useful for us, and I'll say that much. And from a community perspective, we're able to find companies that are using Superset and reach out to them on open source grounds and just say hey, it looks like you're using this. What kind of customizations have you done? How are you deploying it? How are the docs working out for you? How can we bring you in to be a more valued part of our open source community? And that's been huge.
I'm going to add a thing or two there in terms of
Sure.
what we look at and what's been useful. Like companies that were not using the product, last week or last month, that were using it more now. Also interesting is getting an idea of how many uniques are within the different companies, just to get a sense of like what are the larger deployments or the growing deployments. So this is extremely valuable. I think there would be even more value, and we've given some of that feedback to being able to do more slice and dicing, specifically around downloads, where like not always sure where the bursts of downloads are coming from too. So both Evan and I are excited to hear about some of the product improvement later in this session. So we're not just here to talk, we're here to listen, definitely. And we're excited about every time we get a new kind of slice or cut of data, a new metric or a new dimension, we're like, kids at Christmas around this stuff.
Yeah, and on that note, one last slide is that Scarf provides the data, the actual granular event data, in a number of ways. You can get it through exports, you can get it through the API. They've got their Postgres GitHub action, but if you get, in this case, a week worth of document pixel data on our documentation site, you can actually find out which pages are being used the most or the least, so you know where to spend that documentation effort. See just overall how things are doing, where in the world people are visiting from, and you can slice and dice this stuff any old way you want. And that's true for all the streams of Scarf data. So with a BI tool like ours, you can really get in there and get your hands dirty, which is fun. And I highly recommend it. And if you do want to try it with your Scarf data, please do. You can do it on open source grounds. Here's the repo, or you can try a preset for free. So please give it a whirl. Presets by far the easiest way.
Up to 5 seats free, so you can get quite a bit of mileage for a few contributor committers in your community.
And if you want to ask any questions about any of the above, how we've implemented it or our product or anything like that, please do just reach out. But yeah, I'll leave it there. We're free for any questions or whatever.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. That was really great to see. It's always weird doing this virtually, I guess. I don't know. If anyone has questions, feel free to drop them in chat or just raise your hand in Zoom, and we can call on you and do it that way. And maybe while we wait, because we have a little bit of extra time, so maybe I'll ask one or two while we're waiting if any others want to chime in. So I think in terms of the really concrete data and metrics that you guys are looking at, you mentioned quite a number of different things that were of interest there. And I think the one that seems like it has a lot of applications is the version adoption. You mentioned the security, the security angle of wanting to understand, if there are vulnerabilities, like how far back do you want to go to patch these kinds of things, et cetera. I'm curious from the superset community side, on like a week to week, month to month basis, what are the important metrics that you're looking at with version adoption? Like why do you care if people are upgrading, this kind of thing? And when you are seeing these bottlenecks, what do you guys do to mitigate them?
I'd say one of the main reasons we want to keep an eye on version adoption is to figure out how far back we have to support GitHub issues and things like that. We're always trying to come up with a policy of like, what is our sort of LTS version support? And, we kind of change it very slowly over the years a little bit, but this sort of information that we have now tells us like, okay, is everybody on 4.0 or at least the significant population? If not, then we have to keep supporting our 3.1 issues to some extent, or at least the security stuff, but opportunistically more bug fixes and things like that. So we'll probably keep putting out 3.1.x versions as long as we need to until the critical mass is over to the 4.0 land or 4.1 comes out. And so this lets us know when that moment is and when we can go closing a bunch of issues and stuff like that, which is huge and feels really great. Yeah, and
well, I'll tell you, like one note is, we know very much like what is in different branches and what is, how far behind the different version or branches are, and that's something we can use as to see kind of how not optimum is the community in some ways, right? Like, and when we talk to people across the community, we ask them like what version they use to, and we get a sense for how much people are behind in some ways, and that shows the value proposition too of having like a managed service that is like the latest, greatest version, yet most stable too. So I think that's an interesting thing. We get to see how far behind people are, maybe in some ways too. That's a little scary, and I think we've passed the message in the community too, saying like, hey, you all need to upgrade to one of the LTS branches or to a later version, because there's some really clear issue in a lot of versions that people are still using out there.
Yeah, and in the past, it's also maybe worth saying that with an ASF project, it's not just like putting out a release, and if it passes CI, it's released. You actually have to go through this whole voting process, and there's quite a lot of effort behind it. So we used to make those versions and kind of throw them out in the wind, hoping they were useful, but now we can actually tell if they're needed and if they're being used.
Got it. Yeah, that's really that's great to know. And I think a lot of other projects can probably enact things like this too. I think we see version adoption being a really key metric that folks are looking at, both on the non-commercial side and on the commercial side. A lot. What we hear a good bit of is folks will focus outreach on companies that are stuck on old versions and might need help upgrading, or might just need more support or guidance, or just connecting with your community better. And there's, I think, a lot of opportunities that can be highlighted by seeing really old releases that are still in use by certain companies. Yeah.
I just had an idea that kind of talking about this, in mobile versions, they often prevent you from using certain versions you should not be using anymore too. That might be something we want to do with open source, to have a little thing as part of the software that's like, hey, you are on a version that is known to be unsafe, and you might want to upgrade. Or it'd be great if we could put a comment about just coming to preset. That one would not be able to do. But I think it points in that direction too, to say like, listen, you're using a version that no one should be using at this time. You should be installing this one, this other one, or a commercial offering, maybe, right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of folks in the Scarf community, I think, will be very keen to see how effective those kinds of nudges prove to be, and like what end up being effective strategies to get people to, upgrade in a more timely fashion, et cetera. And I think, Max, you said something that I think was very useful and important there, when it comes to the ASF, that there's a lot of these kinds of guardrails that the foundation puts up, but like ultimately the stuff is really in everyone's interest. And I think one of the really cool things that we've seen, especially within the ASF, Scarf now has customers that are direct competitors, but they work together to get this data hooked up and use it separately, and making sure that the community gets access to this kind of thing. And so I think one of the things that's been really commendable about that kind of model within the ASF is just how effective it is at facilitating collaboration between direct competitors, which I think has been really cool to see. Kind of, I mean, I know that Preset does not really have so much of that at the moment, but it's, I think it really speaks to the effectiveness of that model. And maybe, I guess, one other question that would be interesting to hear. So you talked about the SIP process, the superset improvement proposals, and I think for the folks listening, what we saw the preset team do, I think, was really, really well done when it comes to how like thoughtful and laid out the proposal was, and kind of trying to handle a lot of the objections early. Did you experience much in terms of the way, and did you experience many objections to the initiative before or since you did it? And what has that been like? How have you handled it?
Beforehand, there wasn't a whole lot. There were a lot of questions raised, and we knew there would be around a move like this. So what we did differently than several of our SIPs was actually go out and do a little kind of one-on-one thing, talking to people from different orgs using Superset and being like, okay, if we raise this proposal, what issues will you have with it? And we used that to kind of get ahead of some of those questions. So that's why you kind of see a very defensive looking SIP, where it's like, okay, you're going to ask about privacy. What do you do with the IP, et cetera, et cetera. So we just got ahead of that. And there actually were almost no, contentious questions left after that. It was a very quiet sip for us, which is great. And people are free to rip it off if they want to use it in their communities. And there hasn't been much concern since, except there was a moment, I forget the issue, but the ASF raised a question about the opt-in versus opt-out thing, and then they just kind of made my point, which we already discussed, that we think, you know, few people would use it if you had to enable it manually, but they
It would
seem to
take
be
the
okay
whole
with that.
effort kind of nonsense, right? Like if we
Yeah, so
by default, we're not going to go through the trouble. Like there's no need for us to go through the trouble of trying to put a pixel if it's not on by default.
yeah, in the end, they seemingly agreed, and they were like, "We've got a DPA in place and all as well." So
Yeah, there was some
on with the
precedents
show.
there too, right? So I think at the ASF they had some other analytics tools. What's it called?
Matomo.
Tomo was one that had been pre-vetted, and maybe they had already done some thinking around it. And then we're, you know, working with the ASF over the past like decade. For me, I know how to approach it too, and I know what they're going to think and what they're going to say, and and I know what we're going to say, what I would say as a member of the ASF too, because we are, you know, also active defendants and actors in the ASF. We don't always support everything in every single way, especially the things that reduce friction. Like some of the things around tooling might have a little friction here and there, and some of the things about like privacy first, you know, like sometimes it's like some of these things get put ahead of building open source software that it works for people, you know, really. So I think sometimes we're a little bit apprehensive of the whole process. I think that worked well. And if we were able to do it with the ASF, I think that breaks the ice for other projects within the ASF, but I think for any other software foundation or in any other community, I think if we can pass that test, then everything else after that should be cake.
Completely agree. Well, thank you both so much for sharing, you know, all of your experiences here. For any folks that want to connect with Max and Evan afterwards and ask more questions, I'm sure they're very open to doing so. Yeah, as a user of your guys' software and, you know, just a general fan of your work, thanks so much for presenting, and thank you for working with us. We're excited to be partnering. Great. So coming up next, we are going to talk a bit about Scarf's product and our product roadmap. But I guess just to do the next introduction here, the team at Scarf has been growing and expanding quite a bit over the last few months. And one of the hires I've been very, very excited about is bringing on our fearless engineering leader, Aaron Porter, who is someone who I worked with at a past life back at Pandora, where he led the technical operations org at Pandora. And I think, you know, someone who I talked to about Scarf very, very early on in the journey when it was a totally, totally different thing, you know, back when we were first getting going. And I think it's just been really incredibly exciting to see, you know, our team really, you know, grow and flourish. And, you know, we have a lot of great stuff to build. And with Aaron at the helm, it's been going very effectively. And so I will turn it over to Aaron to talk a little bit about our roadmap and what we've launched recently.
Excellent. Let's see. I think that's working. Hey, yeah, like Avi said, thanks for the intro, the very flattering intro. Avi's pretty good at keeping my ego pumped going through this stuff. I've been with Scarf for about 5 months, and I get the joy and glee with my personality to open my presentation by correcting my boss. Avi said that we did $500 million last quarter. We did $500 million last month, Avi. So like,
right. Yes, I misspoke. Thank you.
Thank you. Inflection. Like Q2 at Scarf has been like pretty crazy. It really felt like, you know, this was one of those kind of graduation moments where like Scarf has kind of become critical infrastructure for a lot of different tools and projects in the open source community. Like Avi said, you know, over $500 million tracked events last month alone. Like the adoption and the usage on our gateway and on our telemetry endpoints is just skyrocketing, and it's super, super cool. So I was going to walk through today a couple of things of, you know, what's been going on at Scarf, you know, what we're working on, and hopefully be able to explain what that's going to mean to you all and how it's going to make your lives better. And then, quick wrap up with some of the stuff that we've got coming in the next quarter, or maybe bleeding into the quarter after that, because deliverables are difficult. We spent a lot of time in Q2 doing like kind of a ground up redesign of Scarf's data architecture, migrating away from a traditional relational database. We'd been built on Postgres for years, and moving towards more of a real-time column-oriented data architecture that we've built on top of a tool called ClickHouse, that just really allows us to, dramatically expand the capacity for real-time analytics by sharding, replicating, and scaling vertically as well. Since the beginning, Scarf had a really interesting approach to how to handle like massive amounts of high cardinality data. Scarf developed this concept of data aggregates, where we would almost pre-process all of the log event data, enrich it, but then summarize it. This was really kind of a very forethought idea, because as the data scaled on the way in, we still kept very predictable, very linear response time. It meant that a customer that had 1,000 events would get the same query response time as a customer that had 100 million events. It was really, really strong, but it was also incredibly brittle, because anytime that we wanted to add a new element, anytime we wanted to enable a new filter, anything like that, we had to kind of go back to the beginning of that aggregation process, pick a window which we wanted to allow people to apply that change, and then reprocess and roll forward. It was strong and stable, but it wasn't really flexible, and it was definitely hitting our developer velocity. When we moved to the column-oriented approach earlier this quarter, there was a lot of learnings, right? Like, it's SQLite, but we had to go back and rebuild almost all of the backend queries. It was really nice that we were able to kind of plug into our data pipeline and run both systems in parallel for a good amount of time. We were able to sit and look at individual query performance time. And as we were rolling this out, all of a sudden, instead of querying these aggregate tables, we were actually running these queries directly on raw event data. The downside for us so far has been that query time is not really predictable, depending on the size of the data set, the window you're querying, the number of events, but the flexibility has just been glorious. It really has just been an entirely green field for both the product and the engineering team to look at the data that we're collecting for our customers and figure out like what can we extract from it, how can we slice it, how can we present it in a more useful way. So sorry, I forgot my transition slide here. I don't have the excuse that I haven't looked at them, but I'm also coming back from vacation and feeling a little bit under the gun for this. Another big focus for us this quarter has been improving our reliability and availability. Like I said at the top, like we recognize that we've become critical infrastructure for projects that implement Scarf. We are customer facing for your customers, and our downtime reflects directly on you, and impacts your credibility with your community and your customers. So Scarf from the beginning has supported a multi-region setup configuration for our gateway. We currently run in Asia, North America, and Europe, but we've been enhancing that to operate in multiple availability zones, improve the reliability of the systems in those regions, really beefing up our backend monitoring for trending and alerting so that we find problems before they're customer visible, and enabling new, more sophisticated and transparent routing on our edge networks, so that when we have the inevitable, operational or software bugs, they're not customer visible either to you as our customers or to your end users either. Our next big initiative from Q2 was data export and partnerships. Like you just heard, like the Scarf adds a lot of value to your data by collating it and enriching it, but the value from the data is when you get to pick it up and digest it and use it where it's where you're already living. Scarf has supported data exports via API, and I think you heard about the Postgres trigger in the last section, but we've also enabled the ability to schedule data exports to cloud storage. Right now it's AWS S3. I think we're going to be looking at adding some other alternatives pretty quickly. But it enables you to define a schedule and define a data set and dump that out in, right now, most of our customers are using CSV, but I think we could do JSON and other formats as desirable. And then you can pick those up in the tools that you use for your day-to-day BI and in the future, hopefully CRM, to understand, like, to get the full value out of your enriched Scarf data. You can do this today by going in the admin panel, and configuring an export, and then the set of tools that can pick up and digest CSVs. It's pretty limitless, right? It really is the most basic data transfer on the internet, and so the flexibility has been really pretty cool. And we're really hoping that this helps enable our customers to to pull the Scarf data into your daily operations and tools, so that it's not just our wonderful and beautiful dashboard that we love and want you to use every day, but we understand that the real power of this data is when you get it in your native tools. A frequent complaint that we get, and we feel it too, because we do use Scarf as well, is that even though Scarf has probably the best in the industry performance of matching and identifying traffic to companies, it's still far from perfect. We've all seen odd matches or questionable matches pop up, and so we are enabling through the dashboard the ability to offer Scarf feedback on company and event matches that are presented. We then digest those and feed it back into our matching pipeline, really working to beef up our first party IP matching and reputation data set. But I think this is one of those minor annoyances that everybody feels. And so we're pretty excited to finally be able to offer the ability to collect this feedback and apply it to your data. The final thing that I wanted to talk about from Q2 is after we migrated over to our new column architecture and started running these queries on the raw events instead of the summaries that we'd been building, it really unlocked our ability to do dynamic sorting and filtering of the reports that Scarf presents. So we have the ability now to take your company, or take your pixel traffic and slice it by organization, slice it by region, and we have the ability to persist those queries. So you can save a filter, you can share a filter, and you can apply those filters to your data exports. I think at this point I am supposed to transition over to another window and give a very brief live demo using the Scarf's data. Cool. So, it really is, I hope, very straightforward, but it delighted us. So I hope you get some joy out of it too. So, coming into Scarf's package insights, we can expand a filter, and, maybe our sales and marketing team wants to do a little bit of outreach. Maybe they're going to a conference, and look for the users that have a tech stack that that includes the Postgres database. It sorts down from our 15,000 users on this package. What if we want to add a further refinement and say, like, which of these are from the Fortune 500? It's still a pretty impressive group. Maybe it's too many to dig into. And so we can keep stacking these and say, like, which ones of these operate in California? Maybe that's not what we want. So we can invert it as well. And just you can understand the flexibility that this brings is just, it seemed game changing to us, right? And by building on top of the exports and tying this all the way through, I think it really does offer some pretty exciting ways to get deeper data out or deeper insights out of your data. And we're working still to add additional filters in here, from the data that we have. Certainly, package version is one that will be coming very, very shortly. But we're looking at all of the metadata, the custom metadata that we're starting to enable to collect, and all of that will be exposed via the filtering. Cool. And that was pretty much it for Q2. It felt like a lot. I hope it's going to resonate with everyone as well. And for Q3, we're going to be continuing to improve our work on data quality, data matching and accuracy, continuing to really invest heavily in our availability and uptime. I've got a target from Avi for 100% uptime on the gateway. We're not there, but we're up for it, and I don't think it's an unrealistic ambition. So pretty excited to see how far we get along that. Continuing to enrich the data that we, the events that we have with additional firmographics, like the demo I just showed, with tech stack. We're looking at what other data we can add to to a company record to help you identify leads, whether that's revenue target, Forbes Global 2000 list, company employee size. Just continuing to dig and enrich the events that we have, and then also working on more first-party data integrations. I think we've the CSV exports were great, just because so many people can pick them up and work with them. But getting closer to CRM tools, especially Salesforce and HubSpot, is kind of really our next step in the first-party data integrations. So that's our ambitious Q3. And I guess at this point, we pause for questions.
Yeah, the group of this size, if anyone has questions, feel free to just jump in and we'll
and we can go pretty wide. It doesn't have to be limited to what we were just talking about. I think you've got Avi and I here. If we can't answer, there is no answer. So happy to field any Scarf questions.
But maybe not.
Maybe not.
Well, I think maybe one thing that I can, add just to kind of wrap this this section up while we wait, if anyone cares to jump in, regardless of how you're collecting the data that lands into Scarf, I think we want to make sure that that data is actionable and useful. And, part of that is recognizing that the data itself, it's noisy and it's not really all that useful on its own. And what makes this stuff useful and actionable is that we are actually teasing out real insights, and that those insights are located in a place where you will actually use them on a daily or weekly basis. And so whatever your go-to-market looks like at your business, we want to make sure that Scarf puts the insights where you need them, when you need them, so that your team can actually use them effectively. And so whether it's the CRM integrations that Aaron was mentioning, so you can see this data right in your Salesforce, HubSpot, et cetera, Or if that's just slicing and dicing the data directly in Scarf, we want to make sure that those bases are all covered. And to use, I really like Max's analogy about the iceberg, of your open source community. I think, for a long time, historically, just the tip of the iceberg, as Max was saying. Historically with Scarf, it's basically been showing you as much of the iceberg as we can. But now this is much more about literally cutting, slicing, and dicing that iceberg in any way to inspect any given cross-section of that iceberg. And that's really, really powerful, I think, for, whether it's answering a question that has just popped up or something where you're driving very, very specific targeted marketing campaigns or, outbound outreach campaigns or these kinds of things. We want Scarf data to fit right where you need them for that process. And so, for folks that are, here right now or listening after the fact, if there are ways that we can do that more effectively, please drop us a note anytime. And it looks like we do have one question. Yeah, have we been collecting data on OpenStack? That's a good question. I think we do have some pieces of OpenStack that are being distributed on Scarf that we might have some info on at a high level, but in general, the way that Scarf tends to work is that the projects will collect data with us, and we will have that data kind of ready to go for them. We do get bits and pieces of this both from third parties. So some of our data partners will, when we get firmographic information back about a given company, we will get some tech stack information. And I don't know off the top of my head if OpenStack is one of those things or not. I'd have to go check, and we can definitely follow up with that. I suspect there are pieces of OpenStack that are being tracked, but probably not we're not working with the OpenStack team directly right now. But the nice thing with things like OpenStack is that you see a lot of other clues about technology that correlates with OpenStack. And so, whether it's like a specific kind of blob storage or a specific kind of, compute hypervisor or whatever that looks like, we do end up seeing bits and pieces and should be able to give you something useful there. So do feel free to follow up with us and we can talk about it a little bit more specifically for whatever your use case is. But I think in general, that's kind of where a lot of this stuff is heading, is that across all the information that Scarf is seeing about open source usage from different companies, we can give you a much richer picture of what your community looks like and what other technology they are using. Yeah. Aaron, I don't know if you want to add anything. I realize I just kind of steamrolled that.
No, that was, yeah, you don't get in front of the A team, right?
Cool. Any other questions? If so, we're running really ahead of schedule, and I guess maybe we won't go quite as over as we thought. Anyone? All right. Well, okay. I guess so. We have another section of this that was not kind of in the originally planned schedule, but I think will still be interesting and hopefully insightful nevertheless. But I think before we jump into that piece, yeah, I do just want to thank everyone again for joining us at this event. I think this will be first of many, so more to come. But in general, I think we want to be available to any of you that are building open source businesses. We just generally want to hear from you more. What are you what's going really well? What's difficult right now? How can this kind of data actually help drive your business operations in a more in a more effective, streamlined way? That's what we exist to do. And your feedback from the community has been really, really crucial to actually make that happen. Because again, this was all of this stuff, from tracking this kind of data to using it, to being open with your community about the discipline and about sustainability in general, is all pretty new stuff. And so I really, everyone here, I really, really commend all of you for engaging with this kind of, historically kind of taboo topic. And here we are talking about it in a way that a lot of the stuff has been fairly normalized when you see big projects in the ASF using this stuff. And when you see the entirety of the Linux Foundation, the CNCF kind of, green lighting this as a practice as well. And so all of that, that normalization would not have been possible without all of the people in the Scarf community that are kind of stepping forward to, get serious and get more professional with this practice of building software out in the open, which I think everyone here agrees is very, very important to push forward and continue if we want to see just a generally more open tech world and tech ecosystem. And so, yeah, thank you all for, all that you are doing to push that forward. And we are here to support you however we can. So with that, what we have next, we are very, very fortunate to be joined by Matt Trifiro, who the former CMO at Heroku, former CMO at Vapor IO, just general someone who has been in the open source game for a very long time, specifically when it comes to marketing. And I think that the practice of marketing in the open source space is a very, still not the biggest. There's not that many people who are an expert in this topic, and Matt Trifiro is one of them. And so I'd like to bring Matt up, and we are going to talk a bit together about just the history of Scarf and a little bit of the story to how we all got here.
Hey, thanks.
Cool. Yeah.
Thanks, Avi. Sorry, I might be losing my voice, so I'll try to. Hopefully, my cool mic will make up for it.
It does.
Yeah, one thing that you probably don't even know is because I'm both older than you, and I may have started my career quite a bit younger than you, but I started back in the day when processors were 8-bit and like 8K or 16K. I mean, it was a lot. It was kilobytes. Okay? I mean, most people don't even know what those are.
I have no idea what you just said.
Yeah, exactly. Kilobytes. I don't know what that is. But I grew up in a closed source world. I grew up in the world of video games where you guarded your source code just, with your life. And in fact, you built all these like crazy copy protection things in to prevent your competitors from getting your source code because that was your letter up. And so, when Richard Stallman first started talking about open source, I couldn't square the circle of, wow, I get to use this awesome compiler tool set for free. And I don't know how they're making any money. I don't know how they're doing this. And he says some things crazy that would put me out of business. I don't even know how to process this. And that was kind of my first experience with open source. But as I've sort of come through, I've intersected some pretty momentous points in open source. I was there in the formation of the CNCF. I was the CMO of Mesosphere. I had Craig McLucky's cell phone on speed dial. He was at Google at the time. He was sort of the patron saint of Kubernetes. And John Gossman at Microsoft, who was leading their open source efforts and trying to get the two of them to, see eye to eye around this. And so there's in addition to open source has this sort of purity, and then it has this like straight up business, and it has this like really dirty underbelly. And I've kind of seen it all. And so I think that's, it's really interesting to be able, I'm an advisor to Scarf. It's really interesting to be an advisor to Scarf, which is really going after two things. One is trying to build a business around open source, which if you don't do it very consciously, you can get yourself into all kinds of trouble. And we can talk about that. And maybe there's like 9 episodes of a podcast that we can talk about that on. And then there's the issue of, how should you think about these issues in open source? And so, Avi, you've got a really interesting sort of the evolution of Scarf, where not only is it an open source project in many senses, supporting the open source community, but it is itself, well, it actually has some closed source code, which is interesting, right? And it is a business, but it's also trying to enable other open source businesses to accelerate their business. So let's start with like where Scarf came from. You were building some tools in open source, and you started to hear from the developer community, and you were sort of frustrated. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so back several companies ago, I was at a very small early stage startup. I was the first engineer at this like payments tech company in San Francisco, and had built a couple of open source tools in my spare time that quickly that company, like my employer, is using super heavily. We're using it running all of our developer meetings on this tool. Our integration tests are being run on this framework that I built. And so I open sourced it, open sourced both of these tools, and pretty quickly found myself in a position where people at big companies like Adobe are pinging me on GitHub saying things like, oh, there's a memory leak in this. Can you fix it? And that traction that these tools got clearly indicated, hey, these things are useful to people at very big companies. And that immediately kind of put me in a position of like thinking about open source business at a high level and being in this position of, these people are having a problem. It's my name on this stuff. I want this stuff to work all the time. Therefore, I'm going to work all the time on these tools to make sure that they
Before you go on, I'm going to interrupt you because I have a very important question. Are you more of an engineer caught inside a CEO's body or more of a CEO caught inside of an engineer's body?
This has maybe switched over time a little bit. I think at the time it was, I knew that I was going to start a business someday, but I was coding. Every waking minute of my life was code, basically. And that's kind of how things were for a long time. So I really like both, but I think these days it's much more, I'm a CEO who really likes building stuff also and really likes working.
I'm watching Aaron's body language to see.
Yeah, I was like, do we get to vote? Like, we've got a bunch of long-time Scarf people.
I would be very curious.
I've worked through those CEOs before who are like, I'm going to fix that bug over on the plane to whatever. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take us off, but I just really had to ask you that. So so you started noticing some activity, decided I'm going to do something about this.
Yeah.
And
right. So when I'm nights and weekends are going and maintaining my tools, right? Like anytime I get a GitHub notification, I just get like a twinge of anxiety about like who has been inconvenienced by me fucking up today, right? And that's like all the time. And so just increasingly was in a position of wondering, should I quit my job and work on these tools full time and try to start a business? And that is kind of the crux of what has led to where we are today about like, how do I make a call like that? If I have a company on the hook using my tools, what do I do with that information? And that kind of incrementally led down a very long road that has led to where we are here.
So a little irony here. You went into business to start an open source business. You couldn't figure out the kind of, the types of analytics and other sorts of information that like typical companies have. Salesforce gets this information, like they can run a business around their product. You didn't see any of that, and then you said, okay, well maybe I can solve that problem for myself.
Well, I think it was, at the time it was first like, well, I don't have what I need to make this happen. Like I didn't have the data. I just had a download count on a package manager. Even when I knew a company was using my tools, like I, at the time, was not a salesperson and didn't really know what to do with that information. But in this moment, what I decided to do was, well, I think I'll just go part-time at my job and work on this more and more, and I'll figure it out.
And what was that? What did that look like? What was figuring it out?
So the first thing that I tried to do was I tried building premium features for some of my tools that someone could buy. And so then what I had to do was I had to build in license validation inside of this random CLI tool that I made for like broker access. Well, now how do I sell them a license and how do I give them a license and how do I know, if they're having problems and all these things? And I ran into just piece by piece, like, oh, it'd be really good if I had installation analytics, and oh, it'd be really good if I knew what flags were being passed, and just I basically got a crash course in hitting all the things that are really hard about building a business.
I mean, if you're starting an e-commerce company today, you can say, okay, I'm going to get, and there's like 20 choices of analytics tools and 20 choices of like, the contact enrichment tools and 20 choices of these things. And if you're an open source, there's this giant hole around.
Yeah, none of them work. Like you can't do most of those things.
Yeah, you can't like product-led growth is the big in vogue thing now, which is the idea of taking, giving a big part of your product away for free and then observing and nurturing people to a paid version when you give them enough value or at a time when they're trying to solve some big problem that you solve in a higher tier. And like, that's what the community edition is, right? The community edition is that piece of software that delivers all this value that then you can like graduate users into your paid edition when they hit some pain point. But like, you don't have any of those tools to do this. And so poor open source sales and marketing is held back. Now, I will say that I am very familiar with the entire spectrum of open source and analytics and measurement in sales and marketing. And there's kind of an ooh factor too, right? It's like, oh my God, surveillance state. Like I'm already giving away all my information, like all of this. And like, so how have you navigated that?
Head on.
Okay.
I think, in general, I think when we got going on this stuff, we knew that it was going to be met with a lot of pushback and skepticism. And I think that was kind of the thing that really appealed to me about this really early on, was that it was going to be very hard, which sounded fun, but also sounded like it'd be important and, impactful and all these, and worth working on. And so what we did, well, first, what I tried to do is build a system package manager that would do all of these things, that would support the analytics and the e-commerce and all these things. And I literally built this package manager and then went out to various GitHub projects, put their stuff on this package manager, and opened up a pull request saying, hey, please merge these install instructions if you want the analytics from this. And a lot of the maintainers just like told me to take a hike, and they were not interested, and they would never be interested. But a couple of them did merge it. And some of them really liked the stats that they got from it, which told us like we were kind of on the right track.
Well, and Max and Evan presented, I saw that, like, they lit, like, I know now how much effort I need to put into this older version to support it. Like, that's what a great
right
sense of visibility into your customer base.
It was, it was one of those things that was clearly going to provide value, like if everyone was using it. And that was clearly not going to happen in the way that we designed it. And so I just started talking to lots more open source folks about, the problems that they're running into when it comes to building their business. And the thing that just kept coming up over and over and over was, if I knew which companies used my tool, I'd be able to do X, I'd be able to do Y, I'd be able to do Z. And so that's what we started to get to work on, about like, how do we just solve that very constrained problem? And so what we did was we found some prominent React developers who were keen to try a tool if we had built it. We built the first version of Scarf.js in like a week, rolled it out. Some big libraries like React. I don't think Tanner is here, unfortunately. No, it would have been good. But React Query, React Table, Final Form, some of these big projects, they start using Scarf overnight. There's like hundreds of thousands of download events coming in through our infrastructure. And the maintainers loved it. And maybe about 2 months later, all the users started seeing what was happening, and they started to really, really push back a lot.
You had a rebellion, pitchforks and torches.
A bit, yeah. And I think this was, this was a pretty like early on thing. Scarf had actually just raised our first round of funding, actually, because we had so much traction with Scarf.js. And a
Were
big
you vilified
discussion
on Hacker News? Is that what happened?
Every time we launched on Hacker News, there was some vilifying for sure, but it all paled in comparison to what happened in the React Flux community back in 2020. We just, so fresh from raising, fresh round $2 million. Everything's going great.
Right.
We're excited.
Like, we're on top of the world. We're going to help all these companies.
Yeah. And basically this discussion erupts, and everyone realizes that they in fact hate what we are doing. We are collecting data at a time they didn't expect. They think that everyone who's using Scarf needs to stop using immediately, and they went to every single GitHub repo that was using Scarf.js and demanded that it be removed. And
seriously,
so
really, like an active campaign to
campaign. Yeah. You can, like, for anyone that wants to go do the reading and research, like, you'll see these issues on GitHub of people saying like,
you're just saying, how am I going to explain this to my investors?
Yeah, exactly. How am I going to? Yeah, exactly. They're saying, how am I going to explain this to our CTO?
I don't have a business anymore because nobody wants me.
We're watching it all burn down. Right.
Right. So what's new?
what we did was I messaged we jumped in the Discord where all these people are talking about this stuff, and I got on the phone with like 3 or 4 of the people who were leading the charge on this anti-scarf campaign, and really just asked them like, hey, this is coming from a place of love for open source and of supporting maintainers and wanting to make a better open source community. Like, we're aligned here. Where are we messing up and how can we do it better? And
were you really that calm?
Well, no,
because that was I don't know if I could have maintained that level of equanimity.
It was one of those things where, I was being as calm as I could be, but inside freaking out.
Yeah, your
like,
baby.
Everything is
right. Yeah, no, I got it.
Yeah. But the really amazing thing about it is that the people who are doing all this work were also doing it out of care. Like, that they're not being paid to do this. They're not.
Yeah. I mean, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I may disagree with them heavily on stuff, but they also really care about open source and they care about privacy and they care.
And that's kind of how open source works. That's sort of the contract. Is there's going to be some democracy, meritocracy, that goes on. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if they don't want your whatever code snippet or whatever it was, so what happened? Like, you're still in business.
We're still in business. Yeah, we're still somehow in business. And so what we learned from these folks is it wasn't about what we were collecting. It was about them being surprised about how and when we collected it.
I'm not even sure I understand what that means. What does that mean?
So we're not collecting anything NPM didn't already collect if you run an NPM install in JavaScript. But when someone runs an NPM install, they were not expecting data to be sent to some third-party startup
and kept and harvested and all of this. Okay. And so how did you give them something they expected?
Right. So the question that I asked one of them was, okay, so you understand why we're doing this and how we're using it, but you don't like the mechanism. So what is the difference between what we are doing and what your average
and every other website on the planet?
Every other website on the planet, uses analytics and tracking pixels and all these things. And so the question was, what is the difference between this and a tracking pixel on a web page?
Yeah.
And they said, well, I expect tracking pixels on a web page.
It's exactly that. It's not a tracking pixel, really.
Exactly. And so what I asked them was, I said, well, okay, if these maintainers are using tracking pixels in their docs, would you be okay with them doing that? And they were like, okay. It's just kind of like they didn't hate it. They didn't hate it.
Right.
Which was enough.
I get it.
Yeah.
I mean, we all feel, as buyers, we all feel a little like uncomfortable with that. Oh my gosh, if I fill out this form, is some SDR gonna like call me and try to find me on LinkedIn? And we're all struggling with that. But like you have to run a business and you have to find like a middle ground. That's really amazing. So do you believe in this middle ground? Like, is this sustainable? Can it reach an equilibrium?
I mean, I think that the middle ground is now shifting, right? Because if it's about expectations, well, expectations change depending on just what there is, right? And so as people get more comfortable with, the new normal for open source, I think what pushing the envelope looks like moves over to the side as well. And so no, I don't. I mean, I think if we look at what tools proprietary software companies have for their like observability, go to market, et cetera, open source still big gap, I think still. Like, you just don't know all the things that
and as you say, it's both on the tooling side. I mean, as a marketer in any other industry, I've got like an amazing, it's like 7,000 tools. Now they probably won't last, but some of them are pretty amazing. And you can't easily adapt them to open source. Like, that's this giant opaque. I mean, it's as if somebody went to one of these product-led growth companies and said, you know what? Okay, we're going to change the rules of the game. People can use your free product without registering, and you have to do that. You're like, well, okay, that's not my whole plan. The reason I give it away for free, and I think so. How? I mean, is there? Is there a solution? What's the solution? How do we?
Where do we go?
Figure this out? How do we figure this out? How do we institutionalize like the pathways that work?
I mean, I think the idea here, well, there's two things. I mean, one is that we know where we'd want to be in theory. We'd want to be where all the other companies are as open source companies. We want all the tools. We want all the, all the information, all the tools, all the, you know, we want to be on an equal footing with a proprietary business, proprietary software business. And so Scarf is going to continue to just try to get us closer and closer. And it's never going to be the exact same situation. We've made very fundamentally different assumptions in the open source world about the relationship our product and software have with one another. But I think the idea here is that and this is why it's so great that we have all these, all these people here from the Scarf community, is that we are building tools that the community then uses and figures out the best processes to run around these tools, right? And so, we heard from like how the preset folks are using this kind of data within their community and in their business. And, we have other customers that are doing...
I mean, your common room integration is a pure example of this. Like you heard from customers that they wanted to get access to your data and said common room. And so you're like, okay, we have an integration.
Yeah. And so like the general thing here is like we're providing the platform for this data collection tools and operationalizing this data. And as we learn from all of our customers what actually works well and what doesn't, we will just continue to facilitate those things and try to, innovate in ways that make that better and more efficient, and just continue to iterate it in that direction, which may land in a different place.
Yeah. And it seems to me that, the open source, it sort of exists on a spectrum, right? From completely closed source to completely like Richard Stallman, pure open source. And I don't even know if because there's still even a license attached to it, I think, right? Like public domain, right? All the way out there. It's just like, I'm not asserting any rights on this. And then there's like a bunch of things in between. And, I think we forget that these are sort of arbitrary, these middle grounds. We've sort of evolved into them. And we got stuck, like admitting that we really wanted to run a business around these things. And I think that's like you see all the controversy over the license changes. And on the one hand, you see why they did it. It's like we would not be a surviving commercial entity if we didn't. But you also see that they kind of like broke the commitment with the open source community. There was like this implied commitment. And I think that the earlier, like before you launch even, if you set up those expectations, if you make that commitment, maybe that's part of the contribution. So you have to figure out how to get people to write this down, right? It's just like, okay, here's part of I mean, if you look at the legal documents, every one of these open source projects at Apache or Linux Foundation is like, it's an LLC, right? It's a corporation. It's got all the things a corporation has. So it has a very, very like defined structure of what it can't do and can do. Maybe we just have to write these things in. I know that we got a little teaser here that I think we want some feedback on the community on, which is, I don't think we know the answer. And I know you feel similarly because you've been on the same calls as I have, and that we'd like to bring some of the different opinions on on commercial open source, like where are those boundaries? How do we codify them? What's the history of all this? And maybe turn it into a podcast. But I guess we'd like some feedback on whether the community really wants something like that.
Yeah, I think like it's something that we're thinking about in terms of, I don't know, Matt's earlier question about like, where does this go? Where do these tools for open source businesses actually, what's the ultimate destination for these kinds of things? And yeah, we don't have the answer to this.
I mean, if you search for open source marketing, you're not going to get any instruction on how to market for a commercial open source company. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
The same thing with sales. Like it doesn't exist. It's just like this tribal knowledge that's kind of been worked out, and there's a lot of bruises along the way. The Confluence and Buoyance got some arrows doing what they did, but it all seems to be moving in a good place. And maybe we can accelerate the arrival at some ground rules if we have the right discussion. So
I think it's very possible. Yeah, and I think like it's one of those things too where it's just this is another vector of collaboration in the open source world, I think, where there's, there's a lot of collaborating on code, things about code and the legal things about code. And now I think the sustainability aspect of like, how do we build really, really, successful businesses around this stuff and keep it going?
And as you were saying, down to the instruction, like how do
Right.
I do X in open source?
Right.
Because like I said, that doesn't exist. Like how do I run an email campaign with an open source project? Like that doesn't exist. And maybe people will say it shouldn't exist and we'll eradicate it because nobody wants junk mail in their email. But there have to be techniques and systems that we all agree on because that's part of the contract, right? Like I have to be able to make a business out of this in order to successfully steward the community long term.
Right. And I think, and that's one of those things where I think we will continue to, we already see some very sophisticated use cases for this kind of data with some of our customers. And I think we've learned a lot of different techniques and approaches. And the reality is we haven't been working on this long enough to really have the kind of wealth of data that, the normal, enterprise SaaS world has had for a really long time, but we will ultimately get there. And I think, for everyone here, like Matt and I talking about all this stuff, just been continually like, I think this exact kind of hole and gap.
Anybody that was willing to stick around for the end of this conversation, like, if you have something you want to add or you want to ask a question or contribute to this in any way, like you've earned it.
Yeah.
Turn your camera on and let loose.
But I think, ultimately, like Matt and I are very keen to talk to the folks at the forefront of this discipline of building businesses around open source and really try to iron out what the state of the art recommended playbook looks like.
That's a good way to say it. Yeah. What is the state of the art?
Yeah. And I think, and the state of the art is something very much in flux right now. I think as pretty much everyone here probably really understands that like there's no well-trodden path that works really well and is proven out yet. But as we see more, as we see the next, Red Hat OpenShift kind of thing come up, as we see, the more and more of these success stories, I think the tactics and playbooks will become a lot more fleshed out. And that's what we want to explore, package up, and ship out to other people. And I think, we're really open to feedback about how we can do that the best way. Yeah.
I think we should wrap. I think so. Yeah. So our part theory is this is the potentially the first episode of this podcast series. We've talked about maybe having, up to 10 guests to talk about these big issues, to sort of frame the issues. Brian Cantrell, of Oxide, but formerly of Joyent and Sun, and, just one of the leaders in open source, has agreed to be one of the guests. And we try to get high caliber guests like that to come and discuss some of these issues. And then Avi, I think we were talking about, pivoting more towards sort of these practical, like, how did you do this? How did you use, this technique from some other, or how did you develop this technique to understand your customer base in order to, I thought the example of which versions to invest support in was just brilliant. Like, of course you want to do that.
Yeah.
So
and I think there's going to be a lot more things like that will probably be very obvious or feel very obvious when we talk about them in 5 years from today of like, oh, of course you're going to run campaigns in this kind of way in the open source world. And we'll look back and be surprised that we didn't think about it sooner. But I think I'm very excited to start to work on that. And for those who have already seen this, we've had kind of a related podcast to this, the Hacking Open Source Business podcast, where we have talked to various, founders, developers, marketing, sales, et cetera, folks about their experiences and, experiences and stories and questions and all these kinds of things. But what we were not doing with that podcast is really ironing out a set of best practices in a way that we can distill down and discuss with the community and see if people agree, disagree, and really pare it down to something that is actually usable and digestible. And I think folks like Brian, but a lot of others in the open source world will have a lot of wisdom for us. And we just need to go grab it and put it all into one place for everybody. So I'm very excited to do that. Yeah.
Sarah, you want to take us out?
Oh, or just, yeah.
Everybody's hanging up.
You've been taken out. Yeah, we're at time. That was really great. Thank you.
Well done, you guys.
Yeah.
Thank
you everyone so much for joining us.
Yeah.
Matt, thank you for being here for the first episode of our podcast, which stay tuned. We'll have links and we'll get that going, but we definitely do want feedback as well, since this is largely just something we've been talking about and ideating and are really excited to actually start working on a bit. And yeah, to all of you again who have been like, again, Scarf starting in a very taboo side of the world in terms of what we do. And now this is something that is much more normal and accepted. And that would not be the case without each of you being here for this ride and helping us push this forward and make open source a better place. So thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate you all being here, and join us in Slack and we can continue the discussion.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.